Week 5 of the fantasy football season. Here's wide receiver start sit every matchup this week. Thursday Night Football, Tampa Bay Buccaneers at the Atlanta Falcons. Mike Evans, he's a start each and every week. Last week found the end zone once again. And both these receivers, a lot of great production in the first few weeks. I know some games, both of them didn't go off at the same time, but Mike Evans, a big play wide receiver. He's had a great career, and especially going in Atlanta on Thursday night where it's going to be high scoring. And he's a start each and every week. Chris Godwin, the same thing, one of the better slot receivers in the league. And this season, being more in the slot has improved his numbers in the rapport and made easier plays for Chris Godwin and Baker Mayfield for this offense. So this week with a good matchup, and Chris Godwin, a top 10 wide receiver in points per game in the early going. He's a start. Drake London for the Falcons a start. He's really starting to get things going the last few weeks. I know Kirk Cousins still not 100%, still taking a lot of snaps out of the pistol and the shotgun formation where they're dropping back and making sure he's not getting hit as much. And this week in a matchup versus Tampa Bay Buccaneers where we've seen their secondary have trouble at times this season. London is a start. Darnell Mooney, he showed some decent flashes so far in the early going, but he's an inconsistent wide receiver where if he's not catching a deep ball, I think the numbers are going to be up and down this season. So this week in the middle of the pack matchup, I have Mooney as a sit. New York Jets at the Minnesota Vikings, first London game of the season. Garrett Wilson a start. I know Garrett Wilson, he didn't do much in last week's game, and that's because Patrick Surtain, one of the best, if not the best corner in all pro football, was on him in that ball game. And also wet conditions, and Aaron Rodgers didn't look great with the slippery football. But like I've said, Garrett Wilson, he hasn't had that patented game this season. I know he's had double-digit fantasy games for 3 out of 4 games this season, but Wilson, he's just not making the big plays. Aaron Rodgers, he's spreading the football out. Alan Lazard's definitely been a big beneficiary of Rodgers back in the lineup. But I think Wilson's start is a start once again this week and bounces back. Mike Williams, Alan Lazard just inconsistent, even though Mike Williams, he's been getting it going the last 2 weeks. The snaps have went up. He had 4 catches, 657 yards versus the Denver Broncos, but still need to see more consistency. And like I said, this offense has been inconsistent in the first 4 weeks of the season. And same with Alan Lazard, 2 good games and 2 games he didn't do much this week in a matchup versus one of the better defenses in the league. Both these receivers are sit. Justin Jefferson a start each and every week. Another touchdown for him at the Green Bay Packers. And this week, I know Sauce Gardner is going to get the assignment, but he's matchup proof. Obviously, it's Jefferson, and you put him in the lineup. Jordan Addison found the end zone twice. Great game it was for him in his return from injury. 3 catches, 72 yards, and 2 touchdowns. But obviously, fluky, and this week a tougher matchup versus a good New York Jets secondary. He's a sit. Jalen Naylor, first 3 weeks of the year, touchdown in each game. Last week, he didn't do anything. 1 catch in that ball game for 32 yards, so he's a sit. Carolina Panthers at the Chicago Bears. Deontay Johnson, last 2 games since Andy Dalton's in the lineup. He's putting up monster numbers. 2 weeks ago versus at the Raiders, 120 yards, a touchdown in that one. And then last week, finally in the end zone, over 70 yards versus the Bengals. So Johnson's locked in. Xavier Legette, he's a flex option for me. Legette, number 2 wideout for the Carolina Panthers, with Adam Thielen on injured reserve with the hamstring. And now I think Legette's going to be locked in if he could keep going out there and performing. Last week, found the end zone. Him and Andy Dalton are on the same page, it looked like, in a ball game where it's going to be a grinded-out ball game at Soldier Field versus the Bears. I think Legette, once again, could play himself into a flex option. Chicago Bears, DJ Moore's the start. DJ Moore found the end zone last week. I know it was only 22 yards and a touchdown, but still the number 1 option on this offense. And this offense has definitely been inconsistent in the early going, but they're still finding ways to win ball games in Chicago. So DJ Moore, I know the numbers have been underwhelming, and I've had him as a buy low candidate this week. And I would start him versus a Panthers secondary that can't stop anyone. Keenan Allen, Rome Odunze. Like I said, this offense is inconsistent. For the most part, DJ Moore has just been the only player on this offense week in and week out that you can count on. So Keenan Allen returned to the lineup last week versus the Rams. Only 3 catches, 19 yards. He don't look healthy. He don't look 100%. And also him and Caleb Williams really aren't the same page. It's tough to trust Allen, even though I know last season had a monster year. He's a sit. Rome Odunze, 1 monster game, over 100 yards in week 3 at Indianapolis. But besides that, he's been inconsistent. And even in a good matchup, both these receivers, to me, are tough to trust. Cleveland Browns at the Commanders, Amari Cooper, 80-yard touchdown that was called back by penalty in that ball game at the Raiders, where he would have a big ball game, but instead he didn't do much. in that one in Vegas in the Week 4 loss. This week, a matchup with the Commanders. I know their defense hasn't been great this season. We've seen receivers, especially the last couple weeks, Jamar Chase, Marvin Harrison, have nice ball games, especially Chase, over 100 yards and 2 touchdowns in Week 3. But Amari Cooper, him and Watson aren't on the same page. They're missing on some deep balls. And also Cooper, he's up there at the age where wide receivers start declining. So this week, he's a flex option. Jerry Jeudy, he's been decent so far in the early going, but he doesn't have much of a ceiling in this Cleveland Brown offense. And this week, Jerry Jeudy, he's a player I wouldn't have confidence in, even with a few teams on bye. He's a sit. Washington, pretty much no one else on this team but Terry McLaurin have fantasy value, I believe, at the receiver position. We've seen nothing from Noah Brown, really. Luke McCaffrey, we haven't seen nothing. Zacchaeus, I know, had a decent ball game last week, but it's either Scary Terry or nothing going on in this receiving game. So the first 2 weeks he didn't do anything was Terry McLaurin, but the last 2 weeks he's gone out there, found the end zone, and had productive ball games. And this week in a matchup, I know with Denzel Ward most likely covering Terry McLaurin, I still believe he goes out there and has a good performance. Miami Dolphins at the New England Patriots, Tyreek Hill, I would still put him in the starting lineup. I know once again we didn't see anything out of Tyreek Hill in that Week 4 loss versus the Tennessee Titans, but something's got to give. And Tyreek Hill, him and Huntley just missed on a couple deep balls in that game. So at least Huntley could drive the football down the field. Now it's about being accurate and getting that deep ball to Tyreek Hill. Like I said, they just missed on a 70-yarder. That would have been a whole different ball game. And for Tyreek Hill, he would have had a pretty good fantasy day where he overthrew Tyreek Hill, believe it or not. But Tyreek Hill with his upside, and it takes one deep ball for him to be a fantasy option. He's a start, even though he's definitely going to be dropping down the rankings once again this week. And Jalen Waddle, but a lot of garbage time towards the end of that one. If he's a sit for me in this ball game, pretty much only guys, I've said this the last couple weeks, that have fantasy value is Achane and Tyreek Hill on this Dolphin team with the injuries. And I don't even believe those guys' ceilings are that high with Huntley at quarterback, or unless they go a different direction and bring someone else in. So Waddle, the last 2 games, he's been pretty much non-existent. Week 3 at Seattle, 4 catches, 26 yards. And Week 4 versus the Titans, 4 catches, 36 yards on 6 targets. So like I said, I know it's a decent matchup on paper at the Patriots, but you just can't trust pretty much anyone on this Dolphin offense. Now to the Patriots, Demario Douglas, Jalen Polk, 2 young wide receivers. I know Douglas a few weeks ago had 14.80 fantasy points versus the New York Jets, but this offense is inconsistent. They're not really moving the football down the field, and you can't trust these wideouts, even with the bye weeks kicking in. Like I said, with good receivers out like Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jameson Williams, A.J. Brown, Devonta Smith, even though they most likely weren't going to play in this week anyway with injury. Even with those guys out, no one on this Patriot team is worth a start for me. So Douglas and Polk, easy sits this week. Buffalo Bills at the Houston Texans. Khalil Shakir, he's banged up a little bit with an ankle injury. We saw it in last week's game. He was getting taped up, and we'll see if he's going to play in this one. But after getting blown out last week, this Buffalo Bill team, they want to get back on the field and bounce back after getting embarrassed on Sunday night, 35-10 at the Baltimore Ravens. So Shakir, the only wide receiver on the team so far in the first month that's been consistent. So this week I still will put him out there as a flex option. And we saw this secondary the last couple weeks of Houston give up big plays. We saw Jefferson in Week 3 have a big ball game versus them. And we saw last week Brian Thomas put in a good game. Keon Coleman, Curtis Samuel, not consistent enough. Keon Coleman, his snaps have gone down over the last few weeks. I know last week he carved out a decent ball game, but nothing special. And like I said, his upside hasn't really been there the last few weeks here for Keon Coleman. So he's a sick. Curtis Samuel, pretty much non-existent all year in this offense for the Buffalo Bills. So he's hard to trust. He's pretty much a wide receiver that shouldn't be owned in many fantasy leagues. He's a sit. Nico Collins, Stephon Diggs, these are must-start wide receivers week in and week out. C.J. Stroud has a good rapport with both these guys. And Nico Collins, the number 1 wide receiver right now in fantasy football. It seems like weekly he's going out there and he's just getting over 100 yards except one game so far this season. Last week, 12 catches, 151 and a touchdown. And this week in a pretty decent matchup versus the Buffalo Bills, which I believe this will be a high-scoring game. He's a must-start. Stephon Diggs, he's stepped right in and fit right in as a team captain with this Houston Texan team. And last week, it was a nice play where it looked like it was designed for him to throw the football. He found no one open, so he ran him himself within the 10-yard line and found the end zone. And this week versus former team, the juice is going to be flowing. He's going to want to go out there and prove to his former team they made a mistake trading him away. And it wouldn't be surprising to me if he goes out there with over 100 yards and finds the end zone in this one. And Tank Dell most likely returning in this ball game. Last week he was banged up with multiple injuries. And Tank Dell, we know he's a dynamic slot receiver. I know the snaps have gone down. The production's gone down with Stephon Diggs over there for this Houston Texan team. But he's still one of the best third receivers in the league. And I think in this ball game, where it could be up and down the field between these both teams, he's going to have flex appeal coming off the injury this week. Next matchup, Indianapolis Colts at the Jacksonville Jaguars. Michael Pittman, he's a flex option for me. I know he came off the 113-yard performance in last week's game, but that was with Joe Flacco at quarterback, and I believe there's a good possibility Anthony Richardson returns in this one at the Jaguars and plays. And we saw the first 3 weeks he didn't do much at all with Pittman. So if Anthony Richardson's the quarterback, he's a flex. But if Flacco's starting and playing, I give Pittman the nod because Pittman's better with a more traditional quarterback. And we saw last season he had a great year with Gardner Minshew. Now to Josh Downs. Last week he came back, had a good ball game, found the end zone with Josh Downs, had a healthy 9 targets as well. And this week, if Flacco's in the lineup, he's still a sit option for me as Downs. We got to see a little bit more out of him, obviously, and see how he recovers after he was out the first couple weeks of the season. Now to the Jaguars, Brian Thomas Jr., a start for me. The rookie's been very impressive, and this is why they went out there in the first round of the NFL draft and took him. He found the end zone last week was Brian Thomas. He's had a couple big games early on in the season, the first 3 out of 4, and this week in a beatable matchup versus a middle of the pack defense, he's a start for me once again. Christian Kirk, a flex option. I know Kirk, the last couple weeks, he's starting to get things going and getting the rapport back on track with Trevor Lawrence, and even found the end zone last week for this Jaguar team, but the receiving yards haven't been great. Gabe Davis has still been a factor in this offense in terms of snaps and getting targets, even though production hasn't been there. And Christian Kirk, like I said, his ceiling just isn't as high now, with Brian Thomas being the number 1 wide receiver and Gabe Davis playing a bunch of snaps. So he's a flex option this week. And Gabe Davis, he hasn't done much as a Jacksonville Jaguar. He's pretty much not owned in most fantasy leagues, and he's an easy sit this week. Baltimore Ravens, Cincinnati Bengals, Zay Flowers, I would give the nod to him, even though in that week 4 matchup versus the Bills, he didn't do much in that game. But that was all Derrick Henry, 209 yards from scrimmage, 2 touchdowns, and Lamar Jackson ran wild as well in that ball game. But Zay Flowers in these type of ball games where they know they can't just run it and got to get it down the field versus a division rival, the Cincinnati Bengals, where these two teams know each other a lot. Zay Flowers, I think, bounces back. He's a start. Rashad Bateman, he's not getting much volume in this offense. Even the tight ends, Likely and Andrews, haven't done much, especially the last 3 weeks. So Bateman, he'll get the occasional deep ball, have a decent game here and there, but he's a sit. Jamar Chase, T. Higgins starts for me in this one. Jamar Chase, what a touchdown he had last week breaking a tackle. No, it wasn't a monster performance, but he had 80 yards, and the family end zone was Chase. He's a start each and every week. And Joe Burrow, he's looked good this season. T. Higgins a start. Him and Burrow just missing on the big plays, even though Higgins, you could see the potential and where it's going, where he's getting open, he's making plays, and they're just missing by a bit. But last week he had 12 fantasy points in PPR leagues with Higgins. And week 3 in his return to the lineup, he just missed a touchdown where he couldn't get both feet in versus the Commanders. So like I said, Higgins is on the verge, in my opinion, of having a big ball game, and it possibly could be this week. Andre Aceves, he's a sit, but he's a solid number 3 receiver and filling in for Tyler Boyd's role pretty well after Boyd left in free agency for Tennessee Titans. I like Andre Aceves as the year goes on. Is possibly an option, but this week he's a sit as the number 3 receiver in this offense. Vegas Raiders at the Denver Broncos. Devontae Adams, he missed last week's ball game with the hamstring injury, but I believe he might return in this one. And it's a tough matchup, no doubt about it, with Patrick Surtain most likely shadowing Adams the whole ball game. But Adams, he's a player you took second, third round of your fantasy drafts for the most part this season. He's been productive, and he's someone I will put in the starting lineup even with Surtain on him. Jacoby Myers, Trey Tucker sits for me. If Adams is out, there's still going to be sits for me. I know Tucker last week had 14 fantasy points in PPR leagues, and Jacoby Myers, it's one good week, one bad week. And like I said, if Adams is out, then Myers is going to get the assignment with Patrick Surtain on him, and it's not going to be a good ball game at all. So both those receivers are sits versus decent Bronco defense. And out of the Broncos, Cortland Sutton last week found the end zone in that upset victory at the New York Jets, where it was a sloppy game all around with the weather wet, slick ball, not much going on. Bo Nix couldn't get anything going early. And then also both teams just not great offenses. So Cortland Sutton found the end zone, like I said. This week it's a beatable matchup, and I think I will put him in there as a flex option with the bye week start and Josh Reynolds, Marvin Mims. They're non-existent in this offense, and pretty much this offense is Bo Nix figuring things out, not putting up a lot of passing yards, rushing a little bit, and working through the running backs and McLaughlin and Williams. So pretty much only Sutton has value. Arizona Cardinals at the 49ers. Marvin Harrison Jr., he's a start each and every week. Last 2 weeks he's gone out there, put on nice ball games, found the end zone early in last week's game. The only thing is his targets haven't been all that great, but he's a number one wide receiver, and he was taken second, third round in most fantasy drafts for a reason, even in a tougher matchup at the 49ers. I like Harrison once again to go out there and play well. Michael Wilson, Greg Dortch, both sits. These guys pretty much aren't great options in this offense. Trey McBride, I expect him to return to the lineup after missing last week's game versus the Commanders with a concussion. And like I said, these are third, fourth options in this offense, where pretty much James Conner, Trey McBride, and Marvin Harrison the only beneficiaries in this offense. But obviously Kyler Murray running the football as well. Now to the 49ers, I think all these wide receivers are playable. Deebo Samuel will start. He returned last week, surprisingly, where we thought he was going to miss 2-3 weeks minimum, but only a week he missed. It wasn't a great game, but he didn't have to do much in that one, where they blew out New England and had to lead the whole ball game with San Francisco. Brandon Ayuk, this is the last chance for me to give him a starting nod. I like the matchup. Brandon Ayuk and Purdy are just missing on some big throws. I know he had a nice 38-yard catch in that ball game, but didn't do much versus the Patriots. But this one in a division matchup where I could see both these teams go up and down the field early, I think Ayuk, one more chance I would give him as a starting option weekly. Jawan Jennings, after coming off in week 3, 11 catch, 175, 3 touchdown game with the Rams. Week 4 wasn't a monster game. He was still productive, 3 catches, 88 yards on 6 targets versus the Patriots. So Jawan Jennings is a deep ball threat. He's a good route runner, and him and Brock Purdy have a great rapport going back to when Purdy was a rookie working the second team with Jawan Jennings. So this week in a plus matchup on a Cardinal team that can't stop anyone, just giving up 42 points to the Commanders. He's a flex op. New York Giants at the Seattle Seahawks. Malik Neighbors, top 2, top 3 wide receiver this season in fantasy football. He's going out there. He's making the big plays, yard after catch ability, and it doesn't matter what corner's on him. And we just saw Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jameson Williams both have great games in the Week 4 victory versus the Seattle Seahawks. And we know the Giants most likely will be trailing early and often, and Neighbors once again will go out there and get his numbers. The only thing, obviously, he's coming off a concussion in last week's ball game, but with 10 days to heal and saying he was good right after that game, I think Neighbors will be fine, and he's a must start in a top 5 wideout. Wan'Dale Robinson, a flex option. We know yards after catch has been his specialty, and he fits this Giant offense pretty well, I believe, is Wan'Dale Robinson, especially what Daniel Jones wants to do. He's not really deep thrower of the football as Daniel Jones, more underneath routes and looking to lead wide receivers to get yards after catch. So we saw last week 11 catches, 71 yards versus the Cowboys for Robinson. So I think he could go out there and have a good game. And like I said, we saw St. Brown and Jameson Williams both have nice ball games last week versus Seahawks. So Robinson a flex. Seahawks, DK Metcalf a must start. This season he's definitely taken the next step in McDonald's offense and this whole new system for the Seattle Seahawks team. 3 games out of the first 4 with 100-plus receiving yards. Metcalf's a matchup nightmare. This Giants secondary, I don't believe, could stop him at all. He's a start. Jackson Smith-Njigba, he's been pretty decent so far this season. 1 monster game, 1 bad game, and a couple mediocre games for JSN. So this week in a great matchup versus the New York Giants, and coming off a tough loss at the Detroit Lions in a back-and-forth shootout, even though the final score obviously didn't show that 42-29. I think JSN goes out there and has a good game, and he still had 12 targets in last week's matchup at the Lions with 8 catches, 51 yards. So I like the volume he's been getting for the most part this season. And this week versus a weak Giants secondary, he's a start. Tyler Lockett, he's a flex option for me. He's still, I think, in deeper leagues, could go out there and help fantasy owners in 12-team, 14-team leagues. Last week he did have 9 targets, was Lockett, 5 catches, 61 yards. And this week a good matchup versus the New York Giants. And also, like I said, with 4 teams on bye, I think Tyler Lockett will make his way into some lineups, and with a good matchup, and this is a good 3 receiving core for Seattle. He's a flex option this week. The next matchup, Green Bay Packers at the Los Angeles Rams. Jaden Reed is starting this one, 27 fantasy points in PPR leagues, and Jaden Reed, one of the best yard after catch wide receivers in the league. Last season in his rookie year, 10 touchdowns. Jordan Love back in the lineup. He had to get the rust off a little bit. Was Love early in that ball game, but second half almost stormed back with a crazy comeback, down 28-0, losing the game 31-29 was this Minnesota Viking team. So Jaden Reed, like I said, yard after catch, he's going out there. He's making plays. He's looking good as Jaden Reed, and this week he's a start. Dontayvion Wicks coming off a monster game, over 70 yards, and had 2 touchdowns and 13 targets. And now with Christian Watson hurt, and most likely a high ankle sprain, that's going to keep him out for a little bit. Dontayvion Wicks could step right in as that number 2, 3 wide receiver. And I've said this in other videos. Jordan Love's a quarterback that likes spreading the football down the field, and Dontayvion Wicks, after coming off a performance like that, is a flex option with the buys. Romeo Doubs is sit. I know he ran the most routes for this Green Bay Packer team, but he really didn't do much in the passing game. And the Packers, they're not going to throw the football in this one over 40 times like they did last week. But this secondary is very beatable, obviously, of this Los Angeles Ram team. But I have to see more out of Dobbs to put him in the lineup. He's a sit. Tutu Atwell, a flex option. So he's been a good wide receiver the last couple of weeks with Cooper Kupp, Puka Nacua out. And we know he's one of the better slot receivers and yard after catch wide receivers, especially fitting in this Sean McVay offense. A Tutu Atwell, 12 or more fantasy points in PPR leagues in the last 2 weeks with Cooper Kupp out. So he's a flex. Jordan Whittington, last week it was good to see him, 6 catches, 62 yards playing and sharing snaps in the Cooper Kupp slot position with DeMarcus Robinson. But we have to see a little bit more for me to have confidence with Jordan Whittington in the lineup. But like I said, a lot of high praise in the preseason and coming out of the NFL draft and even this season from Sean McVay. But a little more consistency before I would put him in the lineup. But definitely someone that should be owned in 10, 12-team leagues. DeMarcus Robinson, same thing. We haven't seen much from him. I know last season he was a great number 3 wide receiver for this Ram team towards the end of the year behind Kupp and Nacua. But this week, versus a good Green Bay defense in terms of creating turnovers and making plays, he's a sit. Dallas Cowboys at the Steelers Sunday night. CeeDee Lamb, he's a must-start each and every week. Last week, him and Dak got back on the same page. 7 catches, 98 yards, and a long touchdown at the Giants. Brandon Cooks, Jalen Tolbert sits for me. Brandon Cooks, I think his best years are behind him. He's up there in age. 28, 30-year-old range is where wide receivers are past their prime and their body starts to break down a little bit and they lose a step or two. So that's what's happening with Cooks. And this Cowboy offense pretty much runs through CeeDee Lamb and Ferguson anyway. Jalen Tolbert, he showed some flashes on and off as the number 3 wide out this season, but he's not a consistent option week in and week out. I think 12, 14-team leagues, he should be owned in most of those leagues is Tolbert. But as someone even as a flex option versus a good defense, he's a sit. George Pickens a start. Last week, a monster game. Him and Justin Fields for many weeks were just missing on big plays. But last week, in a catch-up type of performance where they almost came back and won that one, was Pittsburgh. He went out there, had a great performance as George Pickens. So it's someone who's a back-end to receiver flex option. Worst case, with Trevon Diggs on him in this one, he's a start. Calvin Austin had a breakout game in week 3 versus the Chargers, but we haven't seen much from him this season besides that ball game. And week 4 didn't do much. So he's a sit in this one. And Monday night, final game of the week, New Orleans Saints at the Chiefs. Chris Olave, he's a start each and every week. First 2 games of the year got off to a slow start, but the last 2 weeks he's looked good. Is Chris Olave. And the funny thing is, the Saints the first 2 games scored 91 points, and the last 2 weeks came back down to earth quickly. But Olave's still producing and putting up points. He's a star. Rashid Shaheed, maybe some people won't agree, but to me, he's a sit in this ball game. I know last week he had 15.7 fantasy points in PPR leagues, and he had 8 catches, which was a career high for Rashid Shaheed. So no doubt about it, he's a speedy wide receiver. They could use him in different ways in this offense as this New Orleans Saints team. But this week, a tough matchup versus at the Kansas City Chiefs, where they're one of the better defenses, believe it or not, in the league. And we just saw them pretty much shut down everyone. Your offense besides Lad McConkey, so Shaheed, I think it would take a deep ball for him to go out there and have a good game. So he's a sit, even though I like him for the remainder of the season. Xavier Worthy, the number 1 wide receiver, it looks like, for this Kansas City Chiefs team. Now with Rashee Rice out for the season with a torn ACL most likely, and Worthy had a nice 54-yard touchdown on a deep ball from Mahomes, which was a perfect throw at the Los Angeles Chargers. So Worthy, you got to put him in the starting lineup. He's going to get more looks. And there's not much left in this receiving room as well. Juju Smith-Schuster, I know he was with this team a few years ago, helped them win a Super Bowl. I know he scored a touchdown week 3 at the Atlanta Falcons, but last week didn't do much in that one at the Chargers. He's a sit. I think his best days are behind him. And Sky Moore, he's been a bust so far over the last few seasons. He's a sit for me as well. So I pretty much think Worthy, they're going to find different ways to get him the football, and he's going to get more targets and volume. So that's wide receiver start sit every matchup for week 5 of the fantasy football season.